Sir, the little girl said, holding out something no bigger than a hospital wristband. My mother said if I ever found you, I had to give this back. The billionaire barely glanced at it at first. Then the color drained from his face. Around them, cameras flashed. Reporters kept talking. Rain tapped against black umbrellas. But for one strange second, Edward Whitmore forgot every person standing there. He could only stare at the faded plastic band in the child's trembling hand. 3 hours earlier, the rain had already begun falling over downtown Chicago. It wasn't a violent storm, just a cold, steady rain that painted the sidewalks black and turned the hospital lights into blurred streaks across the wet pavement. St. Mercy Hospital glowed like a palace of glass and steel against the dark sky. Luxury sedans lined the entrance. Security guards stood beneath awnings. Television crews adjusted microphones while photographers waited for their moment. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Edward Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Medical Group, was donating $50 million to expand pediatric care across the city. Every major news station was there. Every important name in healthcare seemed to be gathered beneath the bright lights. Yet Edward felt none of the excitement everyone expected him to feel. Standing inside the hospital lobby, he adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy coat and stared through the glass doors toward the rain outside. A volunteer handed him another folder containing schedules and speaking notes. He accepted it without reading. Nearby, his attorney was discussing contracts. His chief of staff was answering calls. Everyone needed something from him. Everyone always did. Edward's eyes drifted toward a small table near the wall. The paper coffee cup sat there untouched. Next to it rested a folded hospital bill someone had accidentally left behind. The bill had become damp from a spilled drop of coffee. Strange how something so ordinary caught his attention. Maybe because hospitals always reminded him of things he preferred not to remember. 9 years earlier, one delivery room, one phone call, one funeral-sized silence that had never completely left him. Edward. Vivian Ashcroft stepped beside him. Elegant as always. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. The reporters are ready. He nodded. Of course. Vivian studied him carefully. You're thinking about her again. Edward looked away. Not tonight. Vivian didn't press further. She never did. That was one reason people trusted her. Outside, the rain continued falling. Near the far edge of the property, beyond the television vans and security barriers, a small figure stood alone beneath a broken bus shelter. No umbrella. No warm coat. Just a thin black girl watching the hospital entrance through sheets of rain. Maya Brooks had been standing there for almost 40 minutes. Her sneakers were soaked. Water dripped from the ends of her braids. The old coat hanging from her shoulders had once belonged to her mother. The pockets were stretched from years of use. Inside one of them, wrapped carefully in a faded handkerchief, was the only thing Maya truly feared losing. She reached into the pocket and touched it again. Not because she needed to check, because she needed courage. Across the street, traffic lights changed from red to green. Ambulance lights reflected across puddles. People hurried past without noticing her. That was normal. People rarely noticed girls like Maya. But tonight wasn't about being noticed. Tonight was about keeping a promise. Her mother's voice returned to her the way it always did when she felt afraid. Soft, tired, certain. If you ever find Edward Whitmore, give it to him yourself. Nobody else. Maya swallowed hard. Then she stepped away from the bus shelter and started walking toward the hospital entrance. And as her fingers tightened around the faded bracelet hidden inside her pocket, she noticed something she had never seen before. On the underside of the plastic band, nearly erased by time, was a second name written in tiny blue ink. Nurse Helen Reed. The name sat there beneath the hospital bracelet like a fingerprint time had failed to erase. Nurse Helen Reed. Maya stopped walking. Rainwater dripped from her sleeve onto the faded handkerchief wrapped around the bracelet. For a moment, the sounds around her seemed farther away. The traffic, the reporters, the distant ambulance siren. She had looked at that bracelet hundreds of times, maybe thousands. Yet she had never noticed the tiny blue letters hidden on the underside. Her mother hadn't mentioned them either. Or perhaps she had wanted Maya to find them herself. Across the entrance plaza, Edward Whitmore stepped beneath the awning as photographers called his name. Flashbulbs exploded across the wet pavement. He smiled because people expected him to. He shook hands because cameras were watching. But his eyes drifted toward the small figure moving through the rain. Something about the girl bothered him. Not fear. Not suspicion. Recognition. The strange kind that arrives before reason. Vivian noticed it too. "Edward?" she asked softly. "The interview starts in 2 minutes." He looked away from Maya. "I know." Yet his attention lingered. Maya crossed the street carefully, clutching the bracelet inside her pocket. Security guards were already redirecting guests toward the entrance. Nobody paid attention to a soaked little girl approaching from the darkness. Inside the hospital lobby, a television mounted near the ceiling replayed coverage of the donation event. Nurses moved through the corridors. Volunteers stacked brochures on information tables. Somewhere nearby, a vending machine hummed. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Maya stepped under the awning and paused. Through the glass doors she could see Edward speaking with reporters. Behind him stood Vivian Ashcroft. Elegant. Controlled. Smiling. Maya froze. She had seen that face before. Not in person. In a photograph. The memory arrived instantly. 3 weeks earlier, while sorting through her mother's belongings, Maya had found an old envelope hidden beneath a loose floorboard in their apartment. Inside had been a photograph with worn corners. Her mother stood beside a woman wearing a white coat outside St. Mercy Hospital. In the background, partially cut off by the edge of the picture, stood another woman entering a black sedan. Maya remembered staring at that woman for several seconds. Not because she knew who she was, because her mother had drawn a circle around her face with a black pen. Now, standing outside the hospital, Maya realized the woman in the photograph was Vivian. Her heart began to beat faster. At that same moment, Edward's phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced down. A text message from his chief archivist. The message was routine, boring even. Earlier that afternoon, Edward had asked for several old records connected to a foundation project. The archivist had simply replied that some hospital archives from 9 years ago appeared incomplete. Several files were missing. Edward almost ignored it. Then he noticed the date. 9 years ago, the same year his daughter had supposedly died. His thumb hovered over the screen. Nearby, Vivian casually adjusted the sleeve of her coat. "Everything all right?" she asked. Edward slipped the phone away. "Just paperwork." Vivian nodded. Perfectly calm. Perfectly reasonable. Yet as she turned, Edward caught a glimpse of something unusual protruding from her designer handbag. A laminated access card. Hospital issued. Very old. The plastic had yellowed with age. Most people would never have noticed it. Edward almost didn't. But what truly stopped him was the number printed across the bottom. Room 406. The same number Maya had just discovered beneath the bracelet. Edward did not ask about the access card in Vivian's handbag. Not there. Not under the white hospital lights with cameras waiting and donors smiling behind glass. He only looked at it once, long enough to remember the faded number, then lowered his eyes as if nothing had changed. That was how powerful men survived public rooms. They did not react when the room wanted them to. Maya watched him from the edge of the awning, her small fingers still wrapped around the bracelet. A guard stepped toward her. "Miss, you can't stand here." Maya looked past him, straight at Edward. "I didn't come for the cameras," she said. The guard hesitated, because her voice was quiet but not childish in the way he expected. Edward lifted one hand. "Let her through." Vivian's smile tightened. "Edward, this is not the time. I said let her through." The guard stepped aside. Maya walked across the polished stone floor, leaving little rain marks behind. Her sneakers. Every adult in the lobby seemed to turn at once. Some looked curious. Some looked annoyed. Some looked at her coat and decided, without speaking, that she did not belong. Maya stopped 4 feet from Edward and held out the bracelet again. My mom kept this in a coffee can, she said. Behind the flower. She said paper can burn, but plastic remembers. Edward's face changed only slightly, but Maya saw it. His jaw tightened. Vivian gave a soft, practiced laugh. That sounds like something an adult told her to say. Maya did not look at her. My mom told me not to talk to you. Vivian blinked. Excuse me? Not you, Maya said. Him. She pointed gently at Edward. She said if I talked to anyone else first, the bracelet would disappear. The lobby went still in a way no microphone could capture. Edward held out his hand. Maya did not give him the bracelet. Instead, she unwrapped the handkerchief and showed him the inside seam. There, folded so tightly it had nearly become part of the cloth, was a yellowed taxi receipt. Edward leaned closer. The ink had faded, but the date was still visible. March 17th. 9 years ago. 12:26 a.m. pickup. St. Mercy Hospital. Drop-off. West Halstead Laundry. Vivian looked away too fast. Not much. Only a breath. But Edward saw it. Where did you get this? He asked. Same coffee can, Maya said. There was a picture too. She reached into her coat and pulled out a small photograph, softened by years of handling. Edward took it carefully. A young black woman stood near the rear entrance of St. Mercy, wearing a janitor's uniform under a winter coat. Behind her, half hidden by the open door of a black sedan, was Vivian Ashcroft. Her face was turned away, but the pearl clasp on her coat was unmistakable. Edward remembered that clasp. He had bought it for her after the funeral, because everyone had said Vivian had been so strong for the family. Vivian stepped forward. That photo proves nothing. Her voice stayed calm, but her hand moved to her handbag, covering the old access card. Maya looked at the movement, then back at Edward. She always touches her bag when room 406 comes up, Maya said. Edward slowly turned toward Vivian. He still did not shout. He did not accuse. He only asked, very softly, why do you still have a key card to a delivery room that was closed 9 years ago? Vivian opened her mouth, but before she could answer, Edward's phone vibrated again. This time, the archivist had sent one sentence. The footage from that night exists, but 12 minutes are missing. The message remained on Edward's screen long after the vibration stopped. 12 minutes are missing. Around him, the hospital lobby continued moving as if nothing had happened. Reporters adjusted camera angles. Volunteers carried trays of bottled water. Donors exchanged business cards beneath warm chandeliers. Yet something invisible had entered the room. Something cold. Edward slipped the phone into his pocket. Before he could ask another question, his attorney, Richard Sloane, appeared at his side. Edward, he said quietly, we need to move this discussion somewhere private. Richard's tone was calm and professional. Not hostile. Not angry. Simply practical. This event represents months of work, he continued. If there are questions about old records, they should be handled properly. Vivian nodded immediately. Exactly. She looked toward Maya with a smile that never reached her eyes. No one is accusing this young girl of lying. But surely we can agree that extraordinary claims require careful verification. Several board members standing nearby murmured their agreement. They sounded reasonable, responsible, adult. Maya suddenly became very aware of how small she looked standing in the center of the marble lobby. Her coat was still damp. One sleeve had a loose thread hanging from the cuff. The expensive shoes surrounding her reflected softly in the polished floor. She felt dozens of eyes measuring her. Not with cruelty. Worse, with polite doubt. A hospital administrator stepped forward. Sweetheart, she said gently, why don't we find you somewhere warm while the adults sort this out? Maya tightened her fingers around the bracelet. My mom tried that. The administrator blinked. I'm sorry. She told adults. Maya's voice remained soft. Then adults sorted it out. Silence settled for a moment. Richard cleared his throat. No one is dismissing your concerns. You just don't want me saying them here, Maya replied. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. Edward noticed several board members glance away. Vivian recovered first. "Maya, isn't it?" she asked kindly. "If your mother truly believed something important happened, why wait 9 years?" The question sounded fair. Even Edward felt its weight. Maya lowered her eyes briefly. For a second she seemed younger than 9. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded photograph again. Because she was scared. Vivian's expression did not change. Of what? People with offices. Maya looked around the lobby. People who always knew each other. The words were simple. Yet several hospital executives shifted uncomfortably. A television mounted above the reception desk continued playing highlights from the charity event. Applause echoed faintly from the speakers. Somewhere deeper inside the building, a janitor pushed a cleaning cart down a hallway. The ordinary sounds made the tension worse. Richard gently extended his hand. "May I see the photograph?" Maya hesitated. Then she handed it over. Richard studied it carefully. "Interesting," he said. "But photographs can be misleading." "So can records," Maya answered. Again, nobody spoke. Edward watched her closely. Most children would have become overwhelmed by now. Most would have looked to an adult for rescue. Maya seemed to understand something else entirely. Nobody was coming to rescue her. She had known that before she walked through the doors. Vivian stepped nearer to Edward. "This has already gone too far," she said softly. "For everyone's sake." Edward noticed she never once asked to see the bracelet. Not anymore. Only the photograph. Only the letter. Only the things that could be debated. Never the bracelet itself. Then an assistant hurried across the lobby carrying a tablet. "Ms. Ashcroft," he said, "you asked me to retrieve the archive request." Vivian froze. Only for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Edward's eyes narrowed. The assistant looked confused. "The archive request from this afternoon," he continued. "The one regarding room 406. The color slowly left Vivian's face. Because until that moment, nobody had told the assistant which room number mattered. For a moment, nobody moved. The assistant stood frozen beside Vivian, still holding the tablet. He looked from her to Edward, clearly unaware that he had just said something he was never supposed to know. Vivian recovered first. "That was part of a facilities review," she said smoothly. "Several archived rooms were being audited." It sounded reasonable. The kind of explanation people accepted every day. Yet Edward noticed something he had never paid attention to before. Vivian answered too quickly. Not nervously. Not emotionally. Efficiently. Like someone who had prepared for a question before it was asked. Maya saw it too. She quietly slipped the bracelet back into her pocket. She never let anyone else hold it for long. Not the lawyers. Not the administrators. Not even Edward. Her mother had made her promise. If people started arguing, the bracelet stayed with her. If people started smiling too much, the bracelet stayed with her. If people offered help too quickly, the bracelet stayed with her. "Maya," Edward said gently, "is there anything else your mother left behind?" Vivian immediately turned toward him. Edward. Just his name. Nothing more. But something in her voice felt different now. Maya looked at the floor for several seconds before answering. Then she nodded. "I didn't bring it because I didn't know if I should." Edward crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over her. "Bring what?" Maya reached into the inside pocket of her coat. Slowly, carefully. The motion itself carried weight, as though she were reaching for something fragile enough to break a life. Finally, she pulled out an old flip phone. Not a smartphone. Not something valuable. A scratched silver phone that looked at least a decade old. Several people in the lobby exchanged confused looks. Vivian visibly relaxed. "That's what this is about?" she asked softly. "An old phone." Maya ignored her. She held the device with both hands and looked at Edward. "My mom charged it once every month." Edward frowned. "For 9 years." Maya nodded. "Even after it stopped working right." Richard glanced at the phone. "Why?" Maya swallowed. "Because there was one thing she wouldn't delete. The lobby suddenly felt quieter. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a spoon tapped lightly against a ceramic mug. A television anchor continued speaking on mute above them. Rain slid down the giant windows overlooking the city. Maya pressed the power button. Nothing happened at first. Then, after several seconds, the screen flickered weakly to life. The battery indicator flashed red. 1%. She opened the contacts list. There was only one saved number. Just one. No family. No friends.
No employer.
No doctor. One contact. Edward Whitmore. Nobody spoke. Edward stared at the screen. His chest tightened unexpectedly. "Why would your mother save my number?" Richard asked. Maya shook her head. She didn't save it. Her finger moved to another menu. An old voicemail archive. Most files were corrupted. Most wouldn't open. Years had erased nearly everything. Almost. Maya selected the only surviving message. Static crackled through the tiny speaker. Then a man's voice emerged. Younger. Tired.
Familiar.
Edward stopped breathing for a second. It was his voice. 9 years younger. "Grace," the recording said. "If you ever need anything, call me directly. Don't go through the hospital. Don't go through administration. Call me." The message ended.
No explanation.
No context. Just silence. Edward stared at the little phone. He remembered leaving that voicemail. Barely. Grace Brooks, a cleaning employee who had found an important set of missing records years ago. He had thanked her personally. That was all. Or at least that was what he thought. Maya looked up at him. "My mom listened to that message every year on my birthday." The words settled heavily into the room. Edward's eyes drifted back toward Vivian. Slowly. Quietly. Because for the first time he realized something that made no sense at all. If Grace Brooks had truly been nobody, why had Vivian spent 9 years making sure she never reached him? Edward did not answer Maya's question. He did not defend Vivian. He did not dismiss the phone. He simply stood there looking at the dark screen long after it went black again. 1% battery. One surviving voicemail. One name. Around him, conversations cautiously resumed. The board members began speaking in lower voices. The hospital administrator checked her watch. Reporters waited for instructions. The evening was trying very hard to become normal again. Edward no longer believed it was. "Richard," he said quietly. His attorney stepped closer. "Yes. I want copies of every personnel record connected to St. Mercy from 9 years ago." Richard hesitated. "Tonight. Tonight." His tone remained calm. That was what unsettled Richard. Edward only sounded that calm when he had already made up his mind. "And the missing surveillance footage," Edward added. "I want to know who authorized access to it." Richard glanced toward Vivian before nodding. "Understood." Vivian smiled politely. "Edward, surely we aren't restructuring an entire investigation around an old voicemail." "No," Edward replied. "I'm restructuring it around questions that should have been answered years ago." Vivian's expression remained composed. But she did not speak again. Maya watched the exchange quietly. She had expected anger. Maybe disbelief. Adults usually chose one or the other. What she had not expected was silence. The careful kind. The dangerous kind. An hour later, the gala ended early. Officially, it was due to weather. Unofficially, too many people had stopped talking about pediatric care and started whispering about a little girl carrying an old hospital bracelet. Edward moved into a private conference room overlooking the rain-soaked city. The room smelled faintly of coffee and printer toner. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the lights of Chicago back into the darkness. Maya sat at the far end of the long table with a paper cup of hot chocolate someone had given her. She had taken 2 sips. Nothing more. The bracelet remained in her pocket. Edward noticed. "You don't trust anyone with it." Maya shook her head. "No, sir. Not even me?" She thought about that honestly. "I don't know yet." Strangely, the answer didn't offend him. Across the room, a television mounted on mute showed late-night weather reports. Rain continued sliding down the glass. Somewhere down the hallway, A vending machine dropped a soda with a dull metallic thud. For a brief moment the tension loosened. Then Richard entered carrying a thin file folder. Edward looked up immediately. That was fast. One of the archive managers owed me a favor, Richard replied. He placed the folder on the table. There was a personnel review conducted 9 years ago. Edward opened it. Most of the pages were routine. Employment records, shift schedules, maintenance logs. Then one page caught his attention. Nurse Helen Reed. Terminated. Reason: unauthorized access to restricted maternity records. Edward frowned. That doesn't make sense. Richard nodded. I thought the same thing. Helen was one of the most respected nurses in the building. Maya looked up at the name. She cried. Edward stared at her. What? My mom said Nurse Helen cried. Maya wrapped both hands around the paper cup. She said people who do bad things don't usually cry afterward. Silence settled over the room. Edward looked back at the file. Another detail jumped out at him. The termination report had been approved by Dr. Malcolm Pierce. The same physician who had overseen the delivery that night. The same physician whose name appeared in Grace's letter. Edward slowly closed the folder. 9 years ago, he had believed Dr. Pierce when he said everything possible had been done. He had trusted him completely, trusted his judgment, trusted his grief, trusted his version of events. Outside, lightning flashed faintly beyond the skyline. Inside the conference room, Edward found himself staring at Dr. Pierce's signature. Not because it proved anything, because for the first time in 9 years it no longer looked familiar. It looked rehearsed. And Edward suddenly realized he might have spent nearly a decade distrusting the wrong nurse while believing the wrong doctor. The conference room felt colder after that. Not because the temperature had changed, but because certainty had. Edward sat quietly with Dr. Malcolm Pierce's personnel file in front of him. He did not slam it shut. He did not make accusations. He simply reread the signature one more time and then folded the file closed. That frightened Richard more than anger would have. What are you thinking? Richard asked. Edward looked toward the rain beyond the glass. I'm thinking that lies survive because nobody asks the same question twice. Maya sat silently at the end of the table. The hot chocolate had gone cold. She hadn't touched it in nearly 20 minutes. Her attention was fixed on the old flip phone resting beside the bracelet. My mom used to do that, she said suddenly. Edward glanced over. Do what? Ask the same question again. Maya shrugged. She said people remember their lies differently every time. Richard looked at Edward. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Edward stood. Call Dr. Pierce. Richard blinked. Now? Now. 25 minutes later, Dr. Malcolm Pierce entered the conference room. He looked older than Edward remembered. Silver hair. Expensive glasses, perfect posture, the kind of man who had spent years being trusted. Edward, he said warmly, I heard there were questions about old records. His voice never wavered. Maya noticed that immediately. People who were nervous usually talk too much or too fast. Dr. Pierce sounded comfortable. Edward gestured toward an empty chair. Sit down. The doctor sat. Richard remained by the window. Maya stayed exactly where she was. Nobody mentioned accusations. Nobody mentioned crimes. Edward began with simple questions. Dates, staffing assignments, administrative procedures, the kind of conversation that sounded boring enough to be harmless. Dr. Pierce answered easily, confidently. Then Edward asked, Do you remember Nurse Helen Reed? The doctor nodded. Of course. Why was she terminated? Unauthorized record access. Immediate answer.
No hesitación.
Edward simply nodded. And room 406? Dr. Pierce smiled faintly. The maternity suite? It was renovated years ago. Maya looked down at the bracelet. Her fingers traced the faded plastic. Then she spoke. Did Nurse Helen work that night? Dr. Pierce turned toward her politely. I believe so. Maya nodded once. My mom said she cried. Something changed. Tiny. Almost invisible. The doctor's eyes shifted away for less than a second. then back. Edward saw it. So did Richard. Nobody commented. The room became very quiet. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator bell chimed. On the conference table sat a glass of water nobody had touched. What made her cry? Maya asked. Dr. Pierce folded his hands together. I couldn't tell you. Maya tilted her head. You don't remember? No, another simple answer. Another calm smile. Maya looked at the old flip phone. Then at Edward. That's funny. Dr. Pierce's smile remained. Why? Maya pointed toward the phone. Because the voicemail is dated 3 days after Nurse Helen got fired. The doctor did not react. Not outwardly. But his hand stopped moving. Just for a moment. And? He asked. Maya's voice stayed small. Childlike. Honest. My mom said Nurse Helen called her after she lost her job. Silence. Richard slowly looked toward Dr. Pierce. Edward said nothing. Maya continued. If Nurse Helen didn't know anything important, why would she call my mom after getting fired? Nobody answered. The question hung in the room like a weight. Then Richard's phone vibrated. One short buzz. He looked down. A message from the archive department. The missing surveillance footage had finally finished restoring. 12 minutes recovered. Richard lifted his eyes toward Edward. Across the table, for the first time all night, Dr. Pierce stopped looking at Maya and started looking at the door. And in that moment, he realized something Vivian had not. The little girl was no longer standing alone. Nobody moved after Richard read the message. The recovered footage existed. 12 missing minutes had returned. Rain still slid down the conference room windows, but now the sound seemed distant, as if the storm itself had stepped back to listen. Dr. Pierce remained seated, calm, professional. Yet the confidence that had carried him through the evening no longer fit quite as naturally. Edward noticed that too. Show it, he said. Richard connected the archive file to the conference room screen. The loading icon turned slowly. Nobody spoke while it spun. Maya sat perfectly still with the bracelet resting in her lap. Her thumb rubbed across the faded plastic edge. She had no idea how hospital archives worked. No idea how legal investigations worked. But she understood one thing. Her mother had spent 9 years protecting a truth she was never allowed to tell. The screen flickered. Grainy security footage appeared. A hallway. Timestamp. March 17th. 9 years earlier. St. Mercy Hospital. 12:18 a.m. Nurses walked through the corridor. Orderlies pushed equipment carts. Ordinary hospital life. Richard fast-forwarded toward the missing section. The room grew quieter with every passing second. Then the recovered footage began. No dramatic music.
No hidden confession.
Just reality. Room 406. A door opening. Dr. Pierce watched the screen without expression. Edward watched him instead. A nurse emerged first. Helen Reed. Younger. Moving quickly. Looking over her shoulder. Then another figure appeared carrying a bundled infant. The image quality was poor. The face was impossible to see. But one detail remained painfully clear. The bassinet tag attached to the blanket. Baby girl Whitmore. Nobody breathed. The figure carrying the infant did not walk toward neonatal care. Did not walk toward the morgue. Did not walk toward any emergency unit. The figure moved toward a rear service corridor. Away from the official hospital route. Richard paused the video. The room remained silent. Dr. Pierce lowered his eyes. Keep going, Edward said quietly. Richard obeyed. The footage continued. At the end of the corridor, another person appeared. A woman waiting beside a staff exit. Even through the poor resolution, Maya recognized her immediately. So did Edward. Vivian Ashcroft. 9 years younger. The video showed no audio.
No explanation.
No context. Only actions. The woman accepted the infant. The door opened. The child left the building. Alive. The screen froze on the final frame. Nobody moved. Nobody argued. Nobody offered alternative explanations. Maya looked toward Edward. The billionaire had gone completely still. Not angry. Not shouting. Still. The kind of stillness that comes when a person realizes a memory they buried was never true. His eyes remained fixed on the screen. Baby girl Whitmore. Alive. He remembered the funeral flowers, the sympathy cards, the empty nursery. He remembered signing documents he never fully read because grief had made reading impossible. He remembered Grace Brooks standing outside the hospital loading dock once, trying to say something. He had been too devastated to stop, too eager to escape. He had walked past her. 9 years. 9 years of believing the wrong story. 9 years of trusting the wrong people. Maya slowly reached into her coat pocket. There's one more thing. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Everyone looked toward her. She unfolded a sheet of paper her mother had hidden behind the photograph. A photocopy. Faded. Creased. Preserved through years of fear. Richard took it carefully. His eyes widened immediately. Edward. The paper was an original discharge log. Hospital property. Official. Unaltered. One line remained highlighted in yellow. Infant condition. Stable. Released alive. Room 406. Edward stared at the document, then at the footage, then at Dr. Pierce. The doctor could not meet his eyes anymore. For the first time all night, Maya saw genuine pain cross Edward's face. Not billionaire pain. Not business pain. Father's pain. The kind that arrives years too late. Slowly, he took the bracelet from Maya's hands. This time she let him. Edward held it for several seconds. Then he placed it gently on the conference table beside the discharge record. His voice was calm when he finally spoke. Almost gentle, which made it far more frightening. Call my attorney. The room remained silent after Edward spoke. No one rushed to answer. No one argued. The evidence on the table no longer belonged to rumor or memory. The bracelet, the discharge record, the recovered footage. Together they had done something years of wealth, influence, and carefully managed narratives had failed to do. They had told the truth. The weeks that followed moved more slowly than Maya expected. There was no dramatic arrest in the middle of the night. No instant confession. Real consequences rarely arrived that way. Instead, investigators reviewed records. Attorneys obtained court orders. Hospital auditors reopened files that had not been touched. In nearly a decade, Dr. Malcolm Pierce resigned before the inquiry concluded, but the resignation did not stop the investigation. His medical license was suspended pending review. Vivian Ashcroft lost her position overseeing the Whitmore Family Foundation after the board voted unanimously to remove her. Several members later admitted they had trusted her for years simply because everyone else had. St. Mercy Hospital publicly acknowledged record tampering had occurred under its watch and established an independent review panel for affected families. For the first time, people with power were forced to answer questions instead of asking them. Through all of it, Maya remained exactly who she had been before. She still carried the old flip phone. Still folded Grace's photograph into the same worn envelope. Still corrected adults when they got details wrong. It wasn't March 16th. She reminded one attorney. It was after midnight, so it was March 17th. Small detail, important detail, the kind adults missed. Edward noticed that. He noticed many things now. Months earlier he would have solved a problem with a check. Now he spent time listening. Really listening. Grace Brooks was officially cleared of any wrongdoing. Her employment record was corrected. A legal trust was established in her name to provide support for hospital workers who reported misconduct. The tiny apartment where Maya had lived was replaced by something safer, but not hidden away like a secret. She received educational support, counseling, and legal protection. Not because she was a charity project, because she deserved what should have existed all along. One afternoon, several months later, Edward stood in a quiet room inside his home. The rain had finally given way to spring. Sunlight filtered through the windows. On a shelf near the fireplace sat a framed photograph of Grace Brooks. Beside it rested the hospital bracelet in a protective display case. Not as a trophy, not as evidence, as a reminder. Maya entered carrying the old flip phone. I charged it again, she said. Edward smiled faintly. Still works. Barely. She placed it beside the photograph. For a moment neither spoke. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator in the next room and the distant clink of dishes being put away. Ordinary sounds. Safe sounds. The kind Grace probably would have appreciated. Edward looked at the photograph. Your mother was braver than I ever knew. Maya nodded. She was scared all the time. Edward glanced toward her. Maya shrugged. She just didn't let fear decide everything. The answer stayed with him. They moved into the kitchen a few minutes later. Nothing grand.
No reporters. No speeches.
Just a simple dinner waiting on the table. A bowl of soup. Fresh bread. 2 glasses of milk. Maya climbed into her chair and looked at the glass in front of her. Then she looked at Edward. You know, she said quietly, my mom used to say that important people weren't the ones everybody listened to. Edward felt something tighten in his chest.
No.
Maya shook her head and lifted her glass. Important people are the ones who listen when nobody else does. Edward lowered his eyes for a moment. He couldn't answer right away. Outside, the evening lights came on one by one across the neighborhood. Inside, the old phone rested beside Grace's photograph. The bracelet sat safely in its case. And for the first time in many years, the truth had more power than the people who tried to hide it, because the little girl everyone overlooked had finally been heard.